Hello friend, welcome back to the second lecture or the extension of the lecture over this particular topic, that is culture and world politics. So I am Rahat Hassan, Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. In the last class, friends, we have already discussed culture, culture and politics. In that regard, we already have discussed the objective of this particular topic, the themes of this particular topic, and basic understanding about culture, how or why culture matters in international politics. And we also discussed the various theoretical explanation regarding culture in world politics. In that regard, we discussed about three important theories of culture or international relations to explain the issue of culture in world politics. Now, friend, in this particular class, we will discuss the debate or the issues which are there in world politics regarding identity and culture. So, in that regard, in this particular lecture, after knowing the basic understanding or the theoretical explanation of the issue of culture in world politics, we will try to explain, or we will try to explore more which are related to the debate over culture in world politics. So, in that context, there are certain things we need to discuss so that we can enhance so that we can enhance our skills to understand the issue of culture in world politics. So, in that regard, the first question we will try to address, that is cultural conflict is inevitable. So that the concept of clash of civilization or the hegemonic culture, which is emerged out of that, the concept of globalization or the conception of multiculturalism or one culture dominance in the international system. How that sort of issues is actually uh, confronted by the various other cultures or the another cultures which is there in the international system. So the question of cultural conflict, the question of cultural clash of civilization thesis given by Huntington, and in that regard, why culture became important, or the rise of culture, and how or why the culture is understood or debated in international politics. In that regard, we will look at various factors which pave the way for the discussions of culture or the issue of culture in world politics. So, in that regard, the conception of religious revival, that is the politics and religious interplay, that we will discuss in that. And in addition to that, religious revivalism or religious fundamentalism, you can say, or the religious extremism. In addition to that, how that the various factors like post-colonialism, Asian values, that is the question of cultural relativism, and the question of Islamic revivalism and the issue between Islam and West confrontations, how that sort of things, or and in addition to that, the conception of political Islam and the question of Muslim, that is Muslim questions, how that the Muslim issues is taken by the West. So these are the basic debatable issues which is there in the context of issue of culture and identity in world politics, and how because of that reason the issue of culture become confronting issue between East and West. So these are the particular things, these are the debatable things that we will try to discuss in this particular lecture, and then we will try to conclude this lecture with certain critical understanding about the things we will discuss, or we discuss in this particular topic over culture and world politics. So the question that in that regard, as we discussed in the last class, that the world politics up to the end of the Cold War was most dominated by the ideological sort of conflict and economic confrontation, economic cooperations or economic prosperity, international trade, commerce, national economy. These were the important issue that was discussed, or that was the major subject matter of international relations. But after the end of the Cold War, and because of the various forces of globalization, the issue of culture, the issue of identity become more important discourse and debate in the discourse or in the dynamics of international relations or in the subject matter of international relations. So in that context, there are certain factors which we need to be explained, and then after we can debate certain issues which is related to the cultural issues in the domain of international politics. So as we see that after the end of the Second World War and during the Cold War period, we see in the static phase of the Cold War period, it means after 1950s or up to 1950s or during that particular period, 50 to 60s, we see a kind of emergence of various nationalism issue in the various other parts of the global system, and that more particularly in the case of Latin America and Asia and also in the African nations. So the Latin American nations, in the African nations and Asian nations, we see a kind of nationalism which prevail in the nation-state system of this particular geographical area. So, and also the process of globalization, we see the various factors which prevail to a kind of that forces of globalization that also pave the way for the confrontation between the various cultures in the international system. So in that context, we see the first things that emerge in the international system is the emergence of the various newly independent countries, which was earlier dominated and controlled by their colonial European masters. That is, for example, Britain and some other countries as well, some countries of the Europe as well, like France and some other countries. So in that context, once these countries are liberated, they're trying to achieve or they're trying to preserve their own particular culture or particular identity. So that particular identity and culture, reason to preservation of the culture and identity, that particular issue of culture become one of the factors in the discussion of the culture issue of culture in world politics. In addition to that, there is a certain issue of post-colonial tendency or post-colonial approach to understand international relations. In that regard, these independent countries who are liberated from their colonial master, the approach to look at their social, political, and economic dimension from the post-colonial perspective, the post-colonialists thinkers of the post-colonialists argued that these countries having their peculiar sort of identity, peculiar sort of culture, which are distinct from the European society or European values. So that system, that conception of post-colonialism is become one of the factors for the confrontation of the culture between East and the West. In that regard, also we see the emergence of various sort of issues related to the concept of cultural relativism. So in that context, we need to explain the hegemony, or we need to explain the concept of modernity, which is explained in terms of Western conception of norms and values. So in that regard, the concept of modernity or the modernity approach, they look at the conception of modernity from the perspective of Western conception of values, or the Western or the political, social, and the economic level that these countries achieve. They consider or they determine or they express the concept of modernity from that angle. So they argued that the models of development, the pattern of development, economic development, and also the political stability, and also the social coherency and the social values, the West are achieved, that should be the model of modernity, and that must be adopted by other newly independent countries that we call as the third world countries or the developing nations. So in that regard, the modernity explained in terms of Western system of democracy, Western system of free capital market system, and Western concept of social values, which are rooted in the conception of individualism, which have the root in the concept of individualism. So in that regard, to achieve political stability, there must be a democracy, liberal democratic model, there must be a free participation, and the concept of economic, the level of economic development which are achieved by the Western countries, including the United States of America, there must be a free economy, free trade. There must not be market control sort of economic system, and more precisely in terms of cultural point of view, they referring the concept of modernity, referring the concept of individualism, where the individual must not be controlled or guided by any sort of authority, state or any social pressure. Rather, the individual are free to do whatever he or she likes to do. So the concept of individualism, where the person is free or free from doing any sort of free to do any sort of things, and free from any sort of moral kind of compulsion, social sort of compulsion, or any sort of state sort of compulsion. The individualists argued that the people are free, the people are rational beings, they know their interest best, so there must not be any sort of interference. But that sort of individualism, which are permissive in nature, which means that the society and the state allow the person to do whatever the person likes to do, that is against the values, the morality, the social morality, the social values of the East, more particularly in the case of Latin America, more particularly in the case of Africa and the Asian nations. So that conception of the conception of modernity, and which expressed in terms of Westernity, that create a kind of conflict between the East and the West, created a conflict between the Western models of morality, Western model of governance system, Western model of economic system, contrast to the Asian, or the contrast to the newly independent economic, political and social system that prevail in that part of the world. So that concept of Westernity, or the concept of modernity, which is considered, or which they argued that must be universal in nature, that must be acceptable to the all nations, or the all state in the nation state system, more particularly the newly independent state. The process of nationalism which emerged in that particular area, or particular developing state, or the developing nations, that created a kind of conflict between the values of the East and the values of the West, and the West trying to impose their values, their value system, their cultural values, their social values to the eastern part of the world, that is the newly independent world. So that is another important debatable things in the context of culture, and the theories of international relation try to explain that sort of relation between the East and West culture. In relation to that, we also see the various Asian values that express in terms of cultural relativism also become important issue of debate in the discourse of international relations. We see the Asian nations, there are emergence of the various Asian nations in the world politics. For example, we can take the example of India, we can take the example of China, emergence of China, we can take the example of Brazil, we can take the example of various other nations as developing nations as well, like Japan, Korea, like that. So their economy grow, and they don't want to pursue the values which is prescribed, which is imposed by the Western values, or the values of the West. So the Asian values which emerge in terms of their indigenous values, their indigenous cultural values, which is based on concept of morality, concept of non-violence, the concept of ahimsa, the concept of brotherhood. So, and also the concept of morality, human morality as well, which was against the concept of individualism, which allow the person to do whatever they like to do. So these Asian nations, they have their own peculiar kind of culture and identity. So these countries, once they achieve the level of economy, so they're trying to reject the Western values which reflect in terms of individualism, Western liberal democratic model and economic system. They try to reject that sort of thing, and they try to enforce their values to prevail their own society. So because of that, there is a sort of cultural kind of confrontation between the Asian values and the Western values. In addition to that, we also see that the writing of the Samuel Huntington regarding the clash of civilizational thesis. Before explaining that sort of things, we need to explain also the cultural revivalism which emerged after the after the First World War, and more precisely after 1917 or onwards, we see a kind of religious movement in the Asian countries, whether it is India, whether it is the Chinese civilization, whether we find that sort of religious revivalism in the West Asian nation as well, more particularly in the case of Egypt, Iran, and Turkey as well. So, in that context, the concept of modernity, we see an Indian sort of modern concept of religious revivalism also. There are various social and the cultural revivalist movement in the case of India we see, and they trying these sort of revivalism. They were more against any sort of dominancy or any sort of imposition of the Western values and Western culture in this eastern part of the world, more precisely in the case of India as well. So in the case of China, we also see a kind of their own traditional, their own sort of indigenous kind of culture, which was against the universal consumption or the Western consumption or the modern consumption, as they call it, against that sort of values as well. In the case of Islamic countries as well, we find that there are two types of important revivalist, two expressions of the revivalist kind of tendency regarding the modernity concept is concerned. Before that, we also need to explain, in the case of Islamic civilization or Islamic world, the historical rooted background. From there, that also forced the various thinkers to have their own writing for, and also the movement so far as the religious revivalism is concerned in the case of Islamic nations as well, or Islamic countries as well. So we see that after the First World War, we see the collapse of Ottoman empires, that is the Islamic empires in the nation-state system. So that sort of their values, that sort of system that inspired the various political thinkers and various academic thinkers as well. And in that regard also, that Arab nationalism is also one of the issues that also debatable issues in the context of culture in world politics. So the Arab nationalism, that the Arab nations, they have their own culture, they have their own values, fundamental values to look at into and to preserve that also. So the concept of Islamic values, knowing religious revivalism, and also the anti-colonialism sentiment, Arab nationalism. So that is also expressed in terms of identity and cultures as well. So that revivalism, we also see the concept of modernity, that the Kemal Atatürk in the case of Turkey, he argued that the Western concept of modernity must be applied in the case of Turkey, so that the Turkey can achieve the modernity and also economic development. But it was not in the case of Iran, where there is a kind of religious revivalism under the leadership of Khomeini, and they rejecting the Western concept of dominancy, and they more focus on a kind of revivalism within the Islamic culture, and which was confronted by the East and West sort of our Islamic values and the Western values of modernity. So in that sense, we see a kind of religious revivalism and also the post-colonial kind of approach to look at the concept of culture, to look at the concept of values in the world system. That is also a kind of debatable issues related to culture and world politics. In addition to that, in the post-colonial approach and Asian values, we also can see the concept of non-alignment movement in the discourse and debate of international relations. As we know, the whole post-Cold War period was divided, a kind of ideological conflict between the USA and USSR, that is the two ideology, communist and capitalist society. So the whole world was divided into two blocks, Western bloc and Eastern bloc, but the non-alignment countries, that is the third world countries, they have their own grouping that we call as the non-alignment movement, and they rejecting any sort of domination of the West, whether it is the United States of America or whether it is the USSR. So that sort of things also paved the way for the conception of cultural identity, the third world identity, the cultural identity of the individuals, which was against the concept, which was against the identity and culture of the West. And in addition to that, we also need to explain the concept of Orientalism. That is also one of the reasons for the confrontation of, or the preservation of the third world culture and third world identity, society of the third world identity and values, which was against the stereotyping of the European kind of conception regarding to look at the values, the ideology, the values, the behavior and the thinking of the people living in the eastern part of the world. So the West thinking, but the West consider or West stereotype the various society or the various people of the group having the distinct culture which was against the Western sort of culture. So in that sense also we see a kind of stereotyping, and the people from this part of the world, that is Eastern world, they try to reject that sort of things. In writing we can take the example, or we can explain the example of Edward Said writing of Orientalism, how the West is trying to impose their values, their culture in the eastern part of the society, more particularly in the case of West Asia. So that sort of things is debated in the international relations regarding the issue of culture and the confrontation between the culture in East and West culture in the international system. In that regard, we also see a kind of emergence or the revival of the Islamic religion in the world politics, and because of the Arab nationalism, because of the also process of globalizations that created a kind of closer interaction between the various culture, migrations from the people from the Middle East or the West Asia to the European nations. So because of that closeness of the various culture, they are interacting with the homogeneous or the Western culture, and in that process, the people who are from this part of the world, eastern part of the world, they try to preserve their sort of ideas, their sort of identity and culture in the Western context as well. So that sort of thing, that is what the globalization trying to create a kind of multicultural, pluralistic kind of multicultural kind of identity and culture. But in the process of that, the one types of culture, that is the Western culture or their conception of modernity prevail, or they try to impose their conception of modernity or culture over the every part of the world. But that was not acceptable to the various Eastern country, the Eastern state. So that is also created a kind of confrontation between the East and the West. In the case of, more precisely, the case of the conflict between Islamic values and the Western values, we see there are various factors in that regard. One is the post-colonial kind of explanation, and also the religious revivalist kind of explanation. And we also see the various writings which was anti-colonial in nature, anti-Western in nature. That is the writing of Qutb, writing of Jamaluddin Afghani, the writing of Maulana Maududi. They are rejecting the Western values that they're trying to impose in the Islamic world, and they more rely on the basic conception or the basic ideology of Islam, which is based on Quran and Sunnah. So in that regard, the West consider these sort of things in the Islamic world will prevail, which is creating a kind of confrontation between the East and West kind of things. So the war on terror and the confrontation between the East and West is the better explanation that explains the confrontation between the East and West on the basis of culture and identity in world politics. So in that regard, we see the very important kind of explanation which is given by Samuel Huntington, that is the concept of clash of civilization thesis. So in that regard, he argued that the post-Cold War world, that is the globalized or contemporary world, the conflict will be not between the state, rather it will be based on a kind of conflict between the civilizational conflict. So in that regard, he argued that there are various civilizations prevail in the nation-state system. In that regard, the prominent civilization is the Western civilization, the Islamic civilization, the Chinese civilization, Japanese civilization, Hindu civilizations, and also the kind of civilization which prevail in Africa and Latin America as well. So these are the various civilizations which is there in the nation-state system in the contemporary time. And he argued that there is no any sort of possibilities between the cooperations of these or a kind of cooperative kind of engagement of these sort of civilization in the nation-state system. Rather, he argued that there would be a kind of confrontation, there would be a kind of conflict among the various civilizations which prevail or which is there in the nation state system. He argued that factors emerge or that conflict emerged because of the certain factors that emerge that emerge in the nation state system, and out of that there will be a kind of confrontation or conflict or clash between the various civilizations. In that regard, he argued that there is a kind of decline of the hegemony of a particular culture or the homogeneous culture which is propagated by the West, and which is happening because of the rise of the various Asian nations and also the nationalism which prevail in many parts of the world, and also the rise of the Islamic civilization or the revival of the Islamic revivalism as well. So one factor, that is the decline of the hegemony of the Western culture. Second is the emergence of the various Asian nations, their values, that reflect in terms of cultural relativism. And third one is the rise of China and its own kind of traditional or own kind of culture and identity, and that the Chinese civilization trying to reject the imposition and the hegemony of the Western culture. And lastly, the Islamic revivalism or the Islamic religious revivalism, which is the result of the nationalism which prevailed, and also the various revivalist movement which occurred with the writings of the various Islamist thinkers. There is a kind of revivalism of that particular religions as well. So because of these sort of factors, that created a kind of conflict or kind of tension in the nationalist system on the basis of clash of civilization. That was the main argument of the Samuel Huntington. So we see a kind of the cultural conflict, the issue of cultural conflict, and the concept of post-colonialism, the concept of cultural relativism, the issue of political Islam. The Muslim questions that the people or the individuals or the groups who are migrated from the eastern part of the world, more prominently from the West Asian nations to the European nations, they pursue or they trying to preserve their own identity, own culture which is based on Islamic principles, and they try to preserve that sort of things, and because of that there is a kind of confrontations we find in many cases in the Western society. For example, in case of France, there is the issue of hijab, the issue of parda, the issue of food habits, and also the issue of cartoon so these kind of things we see a kind of debatable issue which sometimes also converted into a violent kind of things just on the basis of preservation of identity and culture of these migrated people from the east to the west. So that the question of Muslim questions from the perspective of the West trying to impose the concept of democracy and their normative and their social, political and economic values to the developing nation, and more importantly in the West Asian nations as well. So the question of political Islam from the perspective of rejection of any sort of imposition of the Western values which is against the values of the Islam. That is the one perspective of the political Islam, to look at the principles or the values of the West, and another argument coming from the West to look at the Muslim questions from the perspective of Eastern values and the conflict or incompatibility with the Western values. So in order to respond that, we see a kind of process that we call the promotion of democracy in the third world countries, or more precisely in the Islamic countries. So in that sense, we also see a kind of confrontation between the East and West, between the Islam and the West. So these are the basic issues that we need to discuss, and that are very important so far as the cultural perspective in the world politics is concerned. So friend, we discussed in the last class related to culture and politics, and this particular class we discussed the importance of culture, the meaning of the culture, and how that culture become a kind of confrontation between the various nations or the various culture in the nation state system. We look at the concept of Orientalism, culture, relativism, and also the issue of political Islam in the context of culture in world politics. Now friend, we can summarize this particular topic, that is culture and world politics, and that we have discussed, in summary, you can say that the Western society have conventionally been portrayed as developed or advanced society, implying that they offer a model that will over time be accepted by all other society. Westernization is linked to the growth of a market or capitalist-based economy, the advanced liberal democracy, and a spirit of values such as individualism, secularism, and materialism. So these are the basic argument that we discuss in that how that Westernization define modernity, or how modernity defined in terms of Westernization. And we also discussed that in this particular class that the politics since the end of the Cold War has been structured less by ideological rivalry and more by issue of culture differences. So in the post-Cold War conflict, post-Cold War era or post-Cold War international system, that they are described more in terms of identity and culture, less in terms of any sort of ideological conflict or state-centric sort of international relations. So that the end of the Cold War has been structured less by ideological rivalry and more by issue of cultural differences, especially those related to identity and culture. Identity politics in its various forms seeks to challenge and overthrow opposition by reshaping a group identity through a process of political cultural self-assertion. So in that regard, the identity politics become very important because of the various factors of globalization. And the identity politics is what is trying to overthrow any universal kind of imposition of the culture over the rest of the world, and that universal culture expressed in terms of westernization and modernization. The clash of civilization theorists argued that we also discussed that how that East and West confrontation is inevitable, and how that various argument given by the Samuel Huntington and also Foucault in that regard of the end of history and clash of civilization. So in the particular clash of civilization theories argued that 21st century global politics will increasingly be characterized by conflict between nation and the group from different civilization. So there will be a kind of clash of civilization between the various civilization which is there in the nation state system. However, such a view ignore amongst other things the complex and fragmented nature of civilization and the extent to which different cultures have coexisted peacefully and harmoniously. Which means that there is a critical kind of explanation that we discuss in the class as well, that how that culture, that clash of civilization theory is not accepting the other harmonious kind of tendency which is there in the nation state system, and we also find in terms of multiculturalism and other pluralistic kind of cultural prevalence, and also the coexistence of the various culture in the nation state system. So that we also discussed, and we also discussed that the most prominent aspect of the growing political importance of culture has been the rise of religious movements. This has been most evident in the fundamentalist upsurge, in which fundamentalism is expressed through a religious political movement sometimes, but not necessarily linked to a belief in the literal truth of sacred text. Friends, we also discussed the issue of identity, culture and religions have acquired particular prominence through their association with attempts to challenge and displace the political cultural hegemony of the West. Friends, we also discussed that this has been reflected in the general phenomena of post-colonialism, but it has also been expressed through the idea that there are distinct Asian values and cultural beliefs that we call as cultural relativism. Lastly, we discussed the most significantly challenge to the West has come from the rise of the political Islam. The image of a clash between Islam and the West may nevertheless be based either on the implicably anti-Western idea of Islamism, or in the extent to which Islam and especially the Arab world have consistently been a victim of Western intervention and manipulation. So that things we discuss in this particular lecture, that how that culture become so important, debatable issue in the context of world politics. Friends, we see that we discuss at length the issue which are related to culture, the themes which with the various issues and the themes which are related to culture, and how that culture become more important issue of debate in the discussion of world politics or dynamics of world politics. Thank you very much for attending this particular class, and we will meet again with new topic within the discipline of international relations in a changing world. Thank you very much once again.